The wind swept across the vast ranch as the setting sun bathed the sky in golden hues. Isabella Carter felt the gentle warmth on her face as she sat on the wooden porch of her house, watching the horses run freely in the fenced fields. But her eyes were fixed on one in particular. Maverick, a Mustang with a gleaming chestnut coat, tinged with an intense reddish hue, standing out like a wild flame against the dusty land. He was powerful, agile, and untamed. And for some inexplicable reason, she felt a deep connection with him. Despite her wheelchair, Isabella never saw herself as fragile. A car accident had left her paralyzed 3 years ago, but her spirit was as fierce as Maverick's. She refused to be defined by her limitations. But not everyone around her saw it that way. "Beautiful, isn't he?" David's voice came from behind her. She didn't answer immediately. David was a charming man, the heir to a wealthy and traditional Texas family. In the beginning, he had been her safe harbor, the man who promised to stand by her after the accident. But over time, the mask fell. He was not the loving husband he pretended to be. His demeanor had grown cold, distant, and lately, something in his expression sent a shiver down Isabella's spine. "Yes," she replied, still watching Maverick. "He's incredible." David stepped closer, placing his hands on her shoulders, his voice low, almost sweet. "I heard they broke him today. Maybe you could try riding him." Isabella was surprised. David had never encouraged her attempts to ride again. He always treated her like she was made of glass. Why had he suddenly changed his mind? Before she could ask, David called one of the ranch hands and ordered Maverick to be prepared in the stables. A part of Isabella hesitated, but her longing to feel the thrill of horseback riding again was stronger than any fear. That night, she had no idea that her own husband had set a terrible plan in motion. The morning sun cast long golden streaks over the ranch as Isabella wheeled herself toward the stables, a strange unease tightening in her chest. It had been years since she last sat on a horse, and the thought of riding again sent a mix of excitement and fear coursing through her veins. But as her eyes locked onto Maverick, she hesitated. His sleek, chestnut coat gleamed under the light, his muscles rippling beneath his powerful frame, but his movements were restless. His ears twitched, his nostrils flared, he was on edge. This was not the demeanor of a horse recently tamed. Something about this felt wrong. Beside her, David walked with a slow, deliberate stride, his hands tucked into the pockets of his expensive leather jacket. "They say he's ready. This could be your chance to feel like your old self again," he said smoothly, his voice almost too casual. Isabella frowned, glancing at the stable hands. One of them, a young man with calloused hands and wary eyes, shifted uncomfortably. His gaze darted toward David before looking away, jaw tightening as if he knew something he wasn't allowed to say. A warning Isabella nearly missed. But before doubt could fully settle in, two of the workers stepped forward, ready to assist her onto the saddle. Her heart pounded as they secured her in place with specialized straps, the familiar scent of leather and hay flooding her senses. As her fingers grazed Maverick's neck, she felt it, that unspoken bond. His skin twitched beneath her touch, and for the briefest moment, his stance softened. He recognized her. He trusted her. But then, something shifted. His ears pinned back, his muscles tensed, and without warning, he exploded forward. A violent jolt rocked Isabella's body as Maverick reared up, his front legs kicking the air before slamming back down. The next second, he bolted. The stable doors blurred past as hooves thundered against the dirt, sending a whirlwind of dust into the air. Isabella gasped, her grip tightening around the reins as panic shot through her. Ranch hands shouted in alarm, some scrambling to cut Maverick off, but he was too fast. Too wild. The wind whipped against her face as the realization struck like a bolt of lightning. This wasn't just fear. He had been provoked. Struggling to turn her head, she scanned the chaos behind her, searching for David. And that's when she saw it. the faintest curl of a smile on his lips. He stood there, completely still, arms crossed over his chest, watching. He wasn't shouting for help. He wasn't surprised. He was expecting this. A cold, sick feeling twisted in her stomach. This was no accident. This was a trap. Ahead of her, the open field stretched for miles. No fences, no barriers, nothing to stop Maverick from running until exhaustion claimed them both. Isabella's fingers trembled as she fought for control, but Maverick was running with the force of a hurricane, his every muscle screaming rebellion. And she had no way to stop him. The wind screamed past Isabella's ears, tearing at her clothes as Maverick surged forward like a force of nature, his hooves pounding the ground with bone-rattling intensity. The world around her became a blur of golden fields and swirling dust, the distant fences and ranch buildings shrinking with every powerful stride. She had no control. Her fingers were white-knuckled around the reins, but no amount of pulling, no desperate yanking, could break through the wild panic driving the Mustang forward. He wasn't just running, he was running for his life. Fear curled like a vice around her chest, but she couldn't afford to let it consume her. She had to think. If she fell at this speed, it wouldn't just be a broken bone. It could be the end. Maverick was strong, unpredictable, and fully aware that someone had tried to break him. David had done something to him, provoked him, drugged him, something. And now, Isabella was paying the price. She glanced back over her shoulder, her heart hammering. David was nowhere in sight. He hadn't even tried to stop this. Because this was exactly what he wanted. Her stomach twisted, but she shoved the thought away. Survive first. Understand later. She sucked in a deep breath, forcing herself to stop fighting Maverick and start feeling him. Tension thrummed through his body like a bowstring pulled too tight, every movement laced with raw fear. He wasn't attacking her, he was trying to escape something. The real enemy wasn't the horse beneath her. It was the man she had married. "Maverick," she called over the deafening wind, her voice tight but firm. She leaned forward, keeping her balance, her fingers loosening just slightly on the reins. No more forcing. No more yanking. She had spent years riding before the accident, years understanding how a horse's mind worked. He didn't need to be controlled, he needed to be guided. For a moment, nothing changed. Maverick's powerful muscles still coiled beneath her, his breath still came in frantic bursts. But then, a flicker of hesitation. His ears twitched back, listening. It wasn't much, but it was something. She used it. She softened her grip, adjusted her weight, shifted his focus. And slowly, inch by inch, his pace began to slow. But just as a fragile sense of relief started to take hold, her eyes widened in horror. Up ahead, where the field should have stretched endlessly, the ground suddenly disappeared. The landscape dipped violently downward, a steep ravine cut through the valley like an open wound. If Maverick didn't stop in time, if she couldn't steer him away, they were going straight over the edge. The ravine loomed ahead, a gaping wound in the earth, its jagged edges plunging into darkness. Isabella's breath caught in her throat. Maverick was still charging forward, his hooves tearing into the dirt, oblivious to the deadly drop just seconds away. She had slowed him down, but not enough. If she didn't act now, they would both go over the edge. She yanked the reins to the left, but Maverick resisted, his body still gripped by panic. His powerful muscles strained beneath her, the force of his gallop making every movement feel like fighting against a tidal wave. The ground beneath them grew uneven, sloping downward. The wind roared in her ears as her pulse pounded with pure terror. There was no time for hesitation. "Maverick, listen to me," she shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. She didn't pull harder. She didn't fight him. Instead, she shifted her weight, guiding him instead of forcing him. She let go of her fear and trusted him. For a second, nothing happened. And then, his ears flicked back. His breathing hitched. He hesitated. It was all she needed. With a sudden, desperate twist, Maverick veered sharply to the left. His hooves skidded against the dry ground, kicking up dust as his momentum threatened to pull them both forward. Isabella gritted her teeth, her body jerking violently to the side as she clung to the saddle. The ravine was just inches away now. One wrong step and it would all be over. The moment stretched into eternity. Then, Maverick found his footing. His back legs dug into the earth, his body twisting with raw strength as he finally obeyed her lead. They lurched sideways, missing the deadly edge by mere inches. Isabella barely registered the deafening silence that followed. The absence of pounding hooves, the absence of the wind screaming past her. Maverick had stopped. They were alive. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she exhaled shakily, her fingers tangled in Maverick's mane. But before relief could fully sink in, a sound echoed behind her, the unmistakable crunch of boots against gravel. Isabella turned her head, her body still trembling. David was coming. And from the look in his eyes, he wasn't here to rescue her. The sound of David's boots crunching against the dry earth sent a violent shiver through Isabella's body. He wasn't running toward her in concern. He wasn't shouting her name, asking if she was hurt. He was moving slowly, deliberately, each step measured, like a man who had been expecting a different outcome. The air between them felt thick, heavy with something unspoken, but Isabella could hear it as clearly as if he had said it out loud. He had wanted her to fall. Maverick stood rigid beneath her, his powerful chest rising and falling in deep, uneven breaths. His body still trembled from the near disaster, just as hers did. The Mustang wasn't the only one who had almost died today. Isabella clenched the reins, steadying herself, but her fingers ached from how tightly she had been holding on. Not just to the saddle, but to the very idea that David still cared. That illusion was gone now, burned away like mist under the scorching Texas sun. David stopped a few feet away, the faintest smirk playing on his lips. There was no worry in his eyes, no concern, just something cold and calculating. He let his gaze drift toward the ravine, as if silently measuring how close she had come to the edge, how close his plan had been to working. When he finally spoke, his voice was light, almost casual. That was impressive. He tilted his head slightly, as if assessing her. I was almost sure you wouldn't make it. A violent pulse of fury surged through Isabella. It was confirmation. No more pretending, no more excuses. He had done this. He had tried to kill her. Every memory, every tender word, every time he had looked at her like she meant something, it had all been a lie. Her breath came in short, sharp bursts, her chest rising and falling with the weight of her realization. He had never planned to stay with her. He had planned to get rid of her. And she had almost let him win. Her grip tightened on the reins until her knuckles turned white. Her voice, when it finally came, was low, raw, filled with a venom she had never felt before. You did this. David let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head slightly, as if she were a child throwing a tantrum over something insignificant. Then, taking a slow step closer, he met her glare with a chilling calmness and whispered, "Now, Isabella, what exactly are you going to do about it?" Isabella's entire body pulsed with adrenaline, her breath still ragged from the sheer force of Maverick's sprint, from the weight of everything that had just happened. Her hands ached from gripping the reins so tightly, her muscles burned, and yet none of that compared to the fire now raging inside her. David had tried to kill her. Not metaphorically. Not in some passive, negligent way. He had orchestrated this. He had wanted her dead. And now, standing just a few feet away from her, he was smiling. Maverick shifted beneath her, his coat slick with sweat, his breath heavy and uneven. He was still on edge, nostrils flaring, muscles twitching like a predator sensing danger. Isabella could feel it, too, the thick, suffocating tension in the air, the unspoken battle unfolding between her and the man she had once called her husband. For years, she had looked at David and seen security. A protector. A partner. Now, she saw him for what he truly was. A threat. David took another slow step forward, his boots crunching against the dry earth. He moved with calm, calculated arrogance, as if none of this was out of his control. His lips curled into an easy, practiced smirk, his tone deliberately smooth. That was impressive. He let the words hang in the air, his gaze flicking from her to the ravine, as if silently calculating just how close she had come to dying. Then he looked back at her, his eyes gleaming with something she could finally recognize for what it was: disappointment. "I was almost sure you wouldn't make it." The casual cruelty of his words hit her harder than she expected. He wasn't denying it. He wasn't scrambling to explain, to convince her that she had misunderstood. Because he didn't care if she knew the truth. Her chest rose and fell in sharp, uneven breaths, her fingers tightening around the reins. For years, she had doubted herself. She had questioned whether she was imagining his coldness, whether she was overanalyzing the way he dismissed her. But there was no doubt now. This was real. This was who he was. David's smirk deepened, his voice dropping into something softer, something almost taunting. "You look shaken, sweetheart." He took another slow step closer, his hands still casually tucked into his pockets. "Maybe you shouldn't be riding at all." That was it. The moment something inside her snapped. Fear had kept her in this marriage. Fear had kept her small. Fear had nearly killed her. But now, sitting on the back of a powerful Mustang that had fought just as hard as she had to survive, she realized something earth-shattering. She wasn't afraid anymore. Isabella inhaled slowly, allowing the anger, the betrayal, the years of suffocating doubt to settle into something colder. Something sharper. Resolve. She squared her shoulders, lifted her chin, and locked eyes with him. "You underestimated me, David." Her voice was quiet, but there was steel beneath it. A finality that sent a flicker of something unreadable through his expression. Big mistake. For the first time, his smirk faded. For the first time, she saw something other than arrogance in his eyes. And before he could mask it, before he could find the right words to pull her back into submission, she yanked the reins, turned Maverick sharply, and took off in a powerful gallop. Not to flee, not to escape, but to reclaim herself. The wind whipped against Isabella's face, her hair flying wildly as Maverick charged forward, his hooves pounding against the earth with unrelenting force. Her heart still thundered in her chest, but not from fear, from clarity, from the sheer, electric realization that she had taken back control. She wasn't fleeing in terror, wasn't desperately trying to survive. She was choosing this. She was leaving. And for the first time in years, she wasn't looking back. Maverick's muscles flexed beneath her, his breath coming in sharp bursts, but he didn't resist her lead. They moved as one, bound by something deeper than circumstance. Two beings who had been caged, manipulated, treated as if they were nothing more than property. But not anymore. They had survived. They had fought back. And now, together, they were reclaiming their freedom. The ranch stretched before her, growing larger as she approached, and Isabella knew she had mere minutes before David made his next move. He wouldn't just let her ride away. He had spent too much time controlling her, too much effort making sure she felt weak. And if there was one thing she understood now, it was that David didn't handle losing well. He would come after her. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. As they neared the stables, Isabella pulled Maverick to a halt, sliding her trembling hands over his mane. She could feel his heartbeat hammering just as wildly as hers, his body still wound-tight with adrenaline. They had made it this far, but the battle wasn't over yet. She took a breath, steady, focused, and swung her leg over the saddle. Her muscles screamed in protest as she maneuvered herself into her wheelchair, but she didn't stop. There was no time for hesitation. Ignoring the startled looks from the stable hands, Isabella wheeled herself toward the house, her fingers gripping the wheels so tightly her knuckles turned white. She didn't have time for explanations. There was only one place she needed to go, David's office. The one place he had always warned her to stay out of. Her breath came in short bursts as she yanked open the drawers, her hands frantically sifting through the chaos of papers, ledgers, and folders. She had spent years feeling like she was losing her mind, questioning every cold look, every dismissive comment, every lingering feeling that something wasn't right. And now, the truth was laid out before her in black and white. Hidden accounts. Transfers under his name. Investments she had never heard of. And then she saw it. A revised will. Her name was there. But next to it, something that made her entire body turn to ice. A date. Today's date. Her breath caught in her throat, a wave of nausea rolling through her as the full weight of it crashed down on her. David hadn't just planned to get rid of her. He had made sure everything was in place for when she was gone. The accident was never meant to be just a warning or a scare tactic. It was supposed to be final. A sound behind her. The faintest creak of a floorboard. A presence in the doorway. Isabella's fingers tightened around the document as a familiar voice, low and dangerously calm, cut through the silence like a blade. "I was hoping you'd never find that." Isabella's fingers trembled as she clutched the document, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it might break through her ribs. The weight of the truth pressed against her chest like a physical force. David had planned this. Not in some moment of heated anger, not as a reckless, last-minute decision. No, this had been methodical, precise, calculated. She could see it now, laid bare before her in black and white. Bank transfers hidden under different names, investment accounts she had never known existed, and worst of all, the revised will. The legal proof that she had been nothing more than an obstacle to be removed. An inconvenience. The sound of slow, deliberate footsteps sent a violent shiver down her spine. David stepped further into the office, his shadow stretching across the wooden floor, swallowing the dim light that streamed through the window. He was in no hurry. There was no panic in his expression, no frantic attempt to justify himself. Because he didn't need to. He had spent years perfecting his lies, twisting her perception of reality until she doubted herself at every turn. And now he was standing here, watching her unravel, knowing that she finally saw him for what he was. A predator. "You always were too curious for your own good," he murmured, his voice carrying a maddeningly casual edge, as if this were just another minor inconvenience he had to deal with. He tilted his head slightly, his lips curling into something almost resembling amusement. "I warned you not to come in here, Isabella. But you never could listen, could you?" She swallowed hard, forcing herself to steady her breathing. She had spent years bending under the weight of his control, letting him decide who she was, what she could do, what she should fear. And that fear had nearly killed her. Nearly. But now, she wasn't afraid anymore. Her grip tightened around the papers, her knuckles turning white. Slowly, she lifted her gaze to meet his, and for the first time, she let him see what had changed. She wasn't broken. She wasn't fragile. She wasn't his to destroy. "You planned this," she said, her voice low, controlled, deadly quiet. But there was no uncertainty in her tone. She wasn't asking. She knew. David let out a slow, almost theatrical sigh, running a hand through his perfectly combed hair. And then, in the most terrifying act of honesty he had ever shown, he smiled. "Planned." He let the word linger for a moment before stepping closer, his voice dipping into something even darker. "No, sweetheart. I orchestrated it." His eyes locked onto hers, and for the first time, she saw something shift. Not fear. Annoyance. Because he had expected her to die today. He had expected to be done with her. And yet, here she was. Alive. defiant, a problem he still had to deal with. And from the way his body tensed, she knew he was about to. A dense, suffocating silence filled the room, pressing against Isabella's chest like a physical weight. David stood just feet away, watching her, his head tilted slightly, his expression unreadable. He was studying her, calculating his next move, deciding how much control he still had. But he had already lost. He just didn't know it yet. The damning documents trembled slightly in her hands, the edges crumpled beneath her tightening grip. She had proof now. Proof of what he had been planning, of the life he had been preparing for after she was gone. It was all there. His secret bank accounts, the revised will, the meticulously documented transfers, all leading to one undeniable truth. David had never intended for her to survive. The accident was supposed to be the end of her. She was never supposed to see this. Never supposed to know. She had spent years living under his control, suffocating under the weight of his quiet manipulations. Every dismissal, every subtle gaslighting, every moment that made her question her own instincts, it had all been part of his plan. He had made her feel like a burden, like an inconvenience, and all the while, he had been preparing for the day she simply disappeared. But he had made a mistake. He had underestimated her. And now she was still here. Still breathing. Still fighting. David exhaled through his nose, slow and controlled, his hands flexing at his sides. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't scrambling for an excuse. No, he was deciding something. Deciding whether words could still manipulate her, or if he had to take a different approach. Isabella, let's not make this worse than it has to be. His voice was soft, steady, a practiced tone. The same voice he had used to comfort her after the accident. The same voice that had told her he would always take care of her. Now, it sounded different. Now, she could hear the lie beneath it. A bitter laugh escaped her lips, sharp and hollow. Worse. The word tasted like poison on her tongue. She lifted the papers slightly, shaking her head. You tried to kill me, David. This is as bad as it gets. A flicker of something crossed his face. Not guilt, not regret, just frustration. A crack in his carefully controlled exterior. If I wanted you dead, you wouldn't be standing here. The words were precise, calculated. Not a denial. Not a justification. Just a fact. Isabella's stomach twisted, but she didn't let it show. She wouldn't let him see the fear creeping at the edges of her mind. Instead, she let something else take over. The rage. The betrayal. The raw, undeniable knowledge that she had wasted years of her life on a man who saw her as disposable. David took another step toward her, slow and measured. And Isabella made her choice. David took another step forward, his shadow stretching across the floor, swallowing the space between them. His expression remained calm, too calm. There was no panic in his movements, no desperation in his eyes. Because in his mind, he was still in control. He had spent years perfecting this dynamic, twisting reality around her until she didn't trust her own instincts. But that power was gone now. Isabella sat motionless, her hands gripping the stack of damning documents, her knuckles white. Every second that passed felt like a blade's edge against her throat. David wasn't stalling. He was thinking, weighing his options, deciding whether words could still manipulate her, or if he needed to take a more permanent approach. Isabella, let's not be rash. His voice was steady, smooth, as if they were discussing an unfortunate misunderstanding, not his attempt to have her killed. He moved closer, inch by inch, his tone lowering into something almost comforting. Calculated. Dangerous. You're upset. I understand that. But if you take a moment to breathe, to really think, you'll see this isn't what you... Don't. Her voice cut through the air like a blade. For the first time, David hesitated. His eyes flickered, just for a second, as if registering something new, something he hadn't expected. Isabella wasn't shrinking back. She wasn't playing the role he had assigned her. She was done being afraid. With a sharp inhale, she moved. Not away from him, not in fear, but with purpose. She grabbed the stack of papers and wheeled herself back, fast, toward the fireplace. The flames crackled inside, casting flickering shadows across the room. David's entire body tensed. "Isabella." His voice was no longer soft. It was a warning. She didn't stop. "All this planning," she murmured, holding up the will, the bank statements, the proof of his betrayal. "All this effort to erase me." She let out a small, humorless laugh, her throat tight with anger. "And you never even considered that I might fight back." And with that, she threw the papers into the fire. For the first time, David lost control. "No!" He lunged forward, but it was too late. The flames swallowed the documents in an instant, curling the pages into ash, erasing the evidence that had taken him years to forge. He grabbed Isabella's wrist in a bruising grip, his face twisted in fury, but she didn't flinch. She met his gaze head-on, unshaken. "What's wrong, David?" she whispered, tilting her head slightly. "Didn't plan for this?" His jaw clenched so tight it looked like it might snap. For the first time, he had no script. No carefully crafted manipulation. No escape plan. She had outplayed him. His grip tightened for a split second before he released her abruptly, his breathing heavy. He couldn't touch her now. Not without consequences. Not without leaving marks, marks that people would see. Isabella took a slow, steady breath. She had won. She wheeled herself toward the door, her pulse pounding, but her hands steady. Maverick was outside, waiting. Freedom was waiting. She didn't look back as she spoke her final words to him. "Goodbye, David." And then she was gone.